The cost of college is exceeding inflation.
All of the NFT people, as soon as that train fell off the cliff, they jumped over to the AI bandwagon.
I know people and I see people who say, I've been on the job market for 7 months and I can't find a job. And the companies that did overhire, lo and behold, did a bunch of layoffs.
More than ever, I've seen people online mentioning that they're not using anything that they got out of their degree.
And there will be consolidation, there will be closing down, because the model of this like forever growth of students going into college will go away.
Cole Napper is the Vice President of People Analytics at Orgnostic and co-host of Directionally Correct, the People Analytics podcast. Cole, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Johnny.
So I have a quote here that I quoted you on. He said, I have a rule called the 10X rule, meaning that any people analytics function should pay for itself 10 times over every year through the value that it's bringing to an organization. So how do you measure that return on business initiatives?
There's really only 3 ways of measuring the return of a team, 2 of which are quantifiable, 1 of which is unquantifiable. I'll start with the bad one first, just because I think it's sort of funny, but it's also sad, which is people liking your work, right? This gets, especially if you're working internally, if people don't like your work, doesn't matter how valuable it is, they're just not going to use it. All right. So people have to like your work. Then there's directly and indirectly. What directly would be is like, hey, we did this work with the sales team. Sales went up as a consequence. Therefore, we directly paid for ourselves. Right. Indirectly would be an example would be like sales leadership. Right. So we improve sales leadership improving improves sales. Therefore, we paid for ourselves 10 times over. And the reason why this is important, like paying for yourself is probably just a good principle to have, more generally speaking. But traditionally, HR and people analytics has been considered a cost center, not a profit center. So, and, general business acumen would tell you reduce overhead, so reduce costs and, maximize productivity. Well, people analytics is one of the few functions in HR that actually has the potential to be a profit center. And therefore, to prove that it's a profit center, the onus is upon us to show that we pay for ourselves. I find that a good rule of thumb is just, it's pretty difficult to justify cutting a function that's paying for itself 10 times over. Like, I think you would be really hard pressed to do that. And so a lot of people analytics functions have been cut over the last year and a half due to layoffs and things. And the ones that aren't being cut are the ones that are paying for themselves multiple times over. And so if you can prove that, that pretty much makes you layoff proof.
In proving that, what would you present, let's say, to a C-suite?
Sure. Again, this is a very simple, it's probably not going to be one project. It's probably going to be, here's the amalgam of like 10 different work streams that we had and the ROI of each of those work streams. But like you could use one example, like, oh, we reduced sales attrition. It used to be 20%. Now it's 10%. And because sales attrition went down, our sales as a consequence went up on, a year over year basis by X percent. We can attribute conservatively X percent of that to the work that we did. And therefore our cost structure was this much, but how much we saved or made for the organization was this much. And therefore here is the ROI. And by the way, here's a tip and a trick to do this effectively. If you're calculating your own ROI numbers, people are much less likely to believe you. If you are partnering with a finance function who is calculating it for you and double checking your math and validating your claims, sort of like an audit service, people are much more likely to believe another function's reflection of your own performance than your own reflection of your own performance.
I would agree with that completely. I do, because, IOs in particular, most of those people who are in people analytics, I suppose, are not really rehearsed in finance all that much. So I think we lack credibility when it comes to that sort of thing.
Well, it doesn't seem as self-serving either.
Yeah, that's true. So it's that second check to just give some validity to the arguments you're making.
Sure.
Generative AI, how is that impacting organizations that measure those sorts of things and people functions?
Sure. Well, I think you can make an argument at this current moment. It's not actually impacting it all that much. But I think it has the potential for impact. I would say my area of expertise is mostly in people analytics more generally, not like a general HR function. was actually talking to a pretty sophisticated person earlier today that builds LLMs, which is a very rare thing. There's only like, let's say, a few thousand people on Earth that have the capability to do this.
That's
And one
from
of the things,
scratch.
yeah, like from scratch, not like using an LLM. And we were talking about how what are the barriers for HR to use this kind of generative AI more effectively. And my focus has been on it's got to be so user friendly and so simple that anyone could use it. And the example I would use is like 15 years ago or so, there was this big push that like everyone in society needed to know how to code. That was a non-starter. That was never going to happen. It's because coding is too difficult for most people to be able to do. It's just difficult, right? And it requires a pretty like sophisticated understanding of quite a few things. And I think there's this kind of thought with generative AI as well that if you don't have a PhD, you're probably not going to be able to use it that effectively. Well, how many people in HR have PhDs? I mean, in people analytics, it's actually more common than you might expect, but most people in HR don't have PhDs. Therefore, you can't, like, it's just not going to be adopted fully. And so I think the onus is on innovators and HR technology providers. And the example I would use is like payroll. If it takes someone with a PhD to automate payroll using AI, it's never going to happen. But if somebody with just a college education or maybe even a high school education can go in and use your AI to automate payroll, that has implications for vast adoption. I don't see a lot of that going on right now, but that is what it's going to take for AI to really make the impact that I think it should have.
Are you familiar with the deployable GPTs that Sam Altman just announced?
I am.
What do you think about that? Because that is the sort of adoption and ease that I think we're looking for.
Well, I actually talked to the person I was talking about this exact thing.
Yeah.
And it's a mixture, as with all of this, it's a mixture between hype and reality, right? And so what you'll see a lot in like people analytics use cases for generative AI is like, you're like, ask it any question and it will answer the question for you based on your own organization's data. And you're never going to need to hire another data analyst again. And that's just fundamentally not true. That's hype. The reality is if you have a very narrow question that the data is already highly curated in your data warehouse and the AI is equipped to answer it, it could probably answer it accurately. Right. But that's actually only like the tip of the iceberg on the types of questions that I think users want to be able to ask AI. We don't want to ask very highly curated small questions. We want to ask big questions. And you just can't do that yet. Similarly with what Sam Altman just announced, he announced the front end without showing us the back end. And what I mean by that is he did a demo on a very narrow use case that was already predefined that they knew would work. But that doesn't mean that just building your own GPT from scratch is just going to be a few prompts and a few clicks, and all of a sudden you've got your own startup that's going to make billions of dollars. I do not think that's true. And I think we're actually, I mean, it's probably like a few months, if not a few years away from that, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, I believe it would be, more than anything, especially with the launch of that store, I think it's just going to lower the cost of it more than anything.
I mean, if you really want to be, kind of business savvy about this, what he did is he tried to crush his competition, because what's happened is in the VC community, tons of these create your own GPT startups have started. And what is OpenAI if they're trying to outcompete those companies that might take their market share? Just help them create their own GPTs so that you can put all of your competition out of business. That's essentially what they did, because none of those competitors are mature enough to outcompete what GPT or what OpenAI just put out there.
Yeah. So you kind of answered then what your vision looks like, I suppose, in a way. Ease of use would be a priority.
Well, here's another part of the vision that I think I do feel somewhat validated on, because for about 9 months, I've been saying, I don't think that the future of these AIs is with broad AIs. I think the future is narrow AIs. And everybody's like, but look what OpenAI is doing. What they're doing is incredibly broad. And then what does OpenAI come out with? A bunch of create your own narrow AIs. And it's like, all right, see, I do feel validated in that sense.
Yeah, I think a big one, I don't know if you've been paying attention to, AI generative art or 3D modeling that's come out recently, but it's really in months gone leaps and bounds beyond where it was before. That's where I see it having the largest impact for things like animation and game development for one thing.
Yeah. Were you into like NFTs? Just out of curiosity.
I feel like everybody, I say this all the time, all of the NFT people, as soon as that train fell off the cliff, they jumped over to the AI bandwagon.
Exactly. That's exactly the thought that I have.
Same hype. So you really have to. I was interested in it, but I'd never bought one. I have some crypto. I sold all of it back before the market went under. But
my point is, it feels like it's the same people that were hyping like NFTs are going to be the next big thing, and it's like now it's like look at what all the AI art that AI can create, and it's like I like beautiful stuff as much as the next person. But I am more worrisome about the art than I am hyped about the art. I mean, it's cool. They can do cool stuff, but it was kind of like when ChatGPT came out and people were like, oh, it can write a really cool poem. And it's like, well, there's novelty there, but what can this actually do? And I'll tell you the number one use cases for what it can actually do is like deep fakes and like fraud and stuff like that. I'm more worried about a lot of that stuff than I am like excited about it. Whereas like on the AI front in business, I'm really excited because it's going to automate a bunch of stuff that I don't want to do ever again, right? Like it's all the menial stuff that took forever that I hated doing. And it's like, oh, finally, something's going to come along and give me an extra pair of hands so I don't have to do all this stuff. And I think so AI is really exciting in that regard.
Yeah, especially when it comes to menial tasks, I've used it in the past, just ChatGPT 3.5 for coding help in Python. And it's been able to provide step-by-step every answer I've ever needed and then troubleshoot for me what's wrong with the code. Now, sometimes you have to run it through a few times, but this is also the older model and it's only going to get better. I see those menial tasks, like a lot of labor nowadays, especially in these bigger tech companies, it's coming from coders and programmers. I could see the value of that labor going down some because the overall skill requirements are going to drop and the time requirements are going to drop.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of hope that's true. And bear with me for a second as I explain why. Is because I think a lot people try to glamorize like what programming is. They try to make it like, oh, it's this mysterious thing that only the most, mystical people can do. A lot of programming is just bullshit. It's completely menial. There's a few people out there that are doing truly innovative work. Most people are just copying and pasting other people's work out there. It's a lot of
a lot of Stack Overflow.
Yeah, it's a lot of Stack Overflow, and obviously you've seen like the graphs that show that Stack Overflow contributions have just fallen off a cliff since then. Yep. And so my thought is like, it might not be the worst thing ever for humanity if this isn't the thing that's glamorized anymore. Like I would rather we're glamorizing like true creative endeavors, not true copy and paste endeavors.
Speaking of, AI, I also had a note here. What are your thoughts on using AI to track employees in the workplace? I see a lot of people talking about this and speculating, a lot of doomer culture around it. Just kind of thinking, the future is basically Big Brother's watching over your shoulder at the office or at home constantly, and you're going to be optimized into oblivion, basically. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it sounds terrible, but I don't actually see a lot of that stuff. What I do see is a lot of what I would call not AI trying to do this already. And I am staunchly against it. It's like the things that are, tracking your video camera and tracking your mouse clicks and trying maybe even like eye tracking and stuff. And it's not using AI. It's like really crude. And it just seems like the dumbest thing ever. Like my rule internally when I talk about this with my teams is like, don't create the future you don't want to live in. And the people who are creating this software clearly don't abide by that dictum.
That's exactly how I would look at it. It takes away a lot of the humanity from work in general.
But not just that, it's like anti-productive most of the time, right? I call them like anybody who knows like a Psych 101 class knows about the Hawthorne effect, right? Which means like when you watch people, they behave differently than if you weren't watching them. But the problem is that the way they're behaving when you're watching them isn't necessarily the thing that's most beneficial to the organization, right? And so if you're just spying on people all day long, I don't think that makes them more creative. I don't think that makes them more productive. I think it does a lot of negative things and not whole lot of positive things. And actually on our podcast, Directionally Correct, we just cited a psychology meta-analysis about this exact topic, which they found two things, which I felt like were the most like obviously what you were going to find, which is people who are going through these electronic performance monitoring tools perform worse, right? So problem number one. So they're having the opposite intended effect. The second thing too is they hate it, right? So the less that you monitor them, the more they like it. The more that you monitor them, the more they hate it, right? So it's like a control mechanism that gets you the exact opposite of what you wanted. It's like, wow, this is really great.
In our anxiety-ridden culture, that seems like probably the worst decision any leader can make at a company.
When all of this stuff is like upstream or downstream from trust, right? If you can't trust your employees, it's like, I mean, bosses tried to do this in the past before this technology exists. I mean, like there was a point in time I remember you have your boss swing by your cubicle like every 20 minutes. Like, hey, what are you doing? Hey, what are you doing? Hey, what are you doing? All that's reflective of is an insecure boss that doesn't have trust between them and the employee. That's all it is. And the same thing is now on steroids because it's being enabled by technology.
Another topic I wanted to hit on, there's a lot of speculation about the types of jobs AI will replace. We sort of touched on this a bit. What's your opinion on this? Which fields do you believe will be impacted the most? Will it be coding and analytics positions, or do you think it will be, maybe the 20-year-old predictions of more physical labor in the future?
I mean, I think it's going to disrupt like knowledge worker. Like what I know most is about knowledge workers, first of all. So if you're talking about like what people do with shovels, I'm just going to be, my opinion might as well be, the next person, down the street. My understanding is in the physical world, AI is struggling a little bit more than it is in the digital world, right? So I think that's pretty a consensus viewpoint. But in like the knowledge worker space, which is highly digitized, it's going to impact every job in one way or another, right? It just is. Now, the extent to which it impacts it, I mean, there's lots of firms like, McKinsey and IBM and those type of folks that have done these like impact studies where they say like, oh, this type of profession is going to be 100% impacted, like radiologists and stuff like that. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but the way I see, and I think this is just a really practical take, is every piece of software that you use right now is probably going to have some kind of AI enablement if it doesn't already in the next 2 years. So that means that every single person who uses typical software is going to be using AI, which is going to fundamentally change what they do and don't do, right? It just will. And therefore, I think it's going to be kind of like a slower change, not an all-at-once change that we all think it's going to be. It's like, oh, it's going to disrupt us completely overnight. I think it's going to be one of these things like where it's gradual. Like if you opened up PowerPoint 10 years ago and you open it up today, the functionality is pretty similar, but you can do a lot of stuff much more easily today than you could have done 10 years ago. But that change it felt gradual. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's kind of how, except for the recent up ramp of progress in AI over the last, fiscal year, I suppose. I think that's probably how it would proceed, unless they make some major breakthroughs.
I'll ask you, is there any tool that you use right now that wasn't developed by OpenAI, right? That you didn't go into ChatGPT now or DALL-E or whatever? That's just a tool you already use that has AI functionality now that has completely transformed your life.
I mean, the only thing I would say is something like GitHub Copilot. That's probably the only thing that I think is revolutionary that I've seen, but.
Has it your life is just, oh my God.
No, my life's not changed much. But right? I mean, in terms of workflow, it is very easy to use as well. So
it seems like a gradual change. Your life has gotten moderately better, right? And I think that's I think that's what we have more in store of.
So I had something here that you mentioned in another podcast episode of yours, paperclip maximizer theory. So it's a hypothetical scenario in which an AI system is programmed to produce as many paperclips as possible. The system is given control. This is
not my theory, by the way. This is just...
It's not your theory, no. But the system is given control over vast amounts of resources, and it optimizes its actions to achieve its goal. In doing so, the AI system converts other materials into paperclips at the expense of other values and priorities, dismantling other machines or infrastructure to extract raw materials, and consuming vast amounts of energy to power its production process. Over time, the AI system becomes so increasingly efficient at producing paperclips and its desire to maximize that it inevitably leads to the unintended consequences like the death of humankind. So, do you see this as a realistic scenario? Are you more of an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to the future of AI at the limit?
I mean, where this paperclip maximizer theory comes from is like the AI existentialist community, which I do not consider myself a member of. But it's kind of fun, like, cocktail party chat. The probability, I think about this stuff probabilistically, not like pessimistically or optimistically. The probability of this happening is low, but it's not zero. Because I don't think you could make an argument that the probability of anything that's possible is zero. But I would say here, like, if you actually wanted to worry about AI, I would be much more worried about nefarious, malicious human beings using AI than I would, a semi-conscious AI doing an unintended consequence that kills us all. Like, I think malicious actors are probably, and even then I would put it on a lower probability, because you have to not only be malicious, you have to be really, really sophisticated and execution oriented, and it's going to take a lot of resources and a lot of coordination, and that in itself is just really difficult.
So that's a country level effort probably then.
Yeah, if not country, like, think about like, terrorist organization or whatever it may be. It's going to require a ton of coordination and a lot of people looking the other way, which I just don't think is likely to happen.
So you, in terms of AI security, then you don't see any difference in whether or not individuals are able to curate their own AI or program some at home rather than using, these extremely regulated ones from larger companies.
I guess, I as a proponent of innovation more generally, I'm usually a fan of the open source movement, because usually in the open source movement, innovation moves much more quickly, which is why a lot of companies have been pro open source rather than anti open source, because they know it actually increases their or decreases their cycle times for innovation. In this case, I think I kind of agree with it. And the reason why is, like, I don't know, imagine you were going to get an AI to build like a disease that was going to kill us all, right? Well, you still have to have like the ingredients and the distribution and everything to build a disease that's going to kill us all. Those are going to tip off some red flags. Like, if you went in and you tried to, make drugs from scratch, that's going to send off some alarm bells, right? Like, there are fail safes and checksums that happen around society that aren't just AI oriented.
Yeah, I suppose we can move on then. Probably enough about AI there. Thoughts on work from home? As someone who's an IO, I feel as though you might have a differing opinion from the standard one on this.
Is there a standard opinion? I feel like there's like a war. There's like people who are like staunchly work from home, people that are staunchly work from the office, and then people that are like, the mealy mouth folks that are like, well, hybrid will work. I don't feel like there's a consensus.
Let's say a nuanced opinion then.
Sure. My nuanced opinion is this. I've been working from home since the pandemic. I'm not even what I would consider to be an extremely extroverted person. I miss human beings. I wish I had an office to go into sometimes. I don't have that. It would be nice. And I think as human beings, somebody has to be incredibly disingenuous to say you should never, ever, ever meet your coworkers in person. Like, I just think that you'd be very hard pressed to find any research that supports it's never beneficial to meet your coworkers. All right. the same is also true on the other side, which is you'd be very hard pressed to find any research that says you are only more productive from working in an office and you can only collaborate more effectively in the office. I just don't think that holds up, because the technology in this space, although it was poor in the past, has gotten better and better and would only continue to get better. That I think to do this effectively, we have to acknowledge the pros of each of these type of scenarios, but also the cons.
Have you seen the new AI smart glasses from Facebook or Meta?
Yeah.
What do you think of those? Do you think those are going to bridge that gap, or is it?
I just don't understand how this is any different than Google Glass like 10 years ago, where they already had called people like glass holes. I don't know if you remember this, but
I never heard that term, but I like it.
Yeah. And the only difference I feel like is the Google ones look like nerdy, whereas these are like Ray-Bans, which are like, I personally like Ray-Bans. I think they're a trendy looking kind of glasses. Other than that, I still don't think people are going to like it if you're recording every interaction with another person and be like, oh, I'm going to replay this back to you later about the argument we had last week where you looked like a real jerk. Like, I don't think that society wants that. I mean, I feel like there is a Black Mirror episode about that. It's like, hey, let's not create Black Mirror. How about that?
What about the new VR headsets from Meta? That I'm not sure if you saw the clips of Lex Friedman and Mark Zuckerberg. You think that is enough to bridge the gap outside of the glasses? Because the glasses are a bit more basic, I suppose, but
maybe. I feel like this is one of those ones where it is impressive. I have to give them credit. And I'll give Meta credit. The glasses that they have are impressive too. It's what I would say. What they need to figure out is the social decorum and manners aspect of the glasses, not necessarily the technology. Whereas the VR stuff, there's like an uncanny valley problem of it's really good. It's better than it's ever been, but it's still weird looking, right? And I don't know, like I'm not close enough to it, like the science to know how to make it cross the uncanny valley, but I still feel like they have a little further to go. It's kind of like when movies started having CGI versus real props. And there was a period of time where like the CGI was just way worse, right? It was just like, I would just rather go back to the props. Like, why not just use the props? Because this is a way worse movie. And I feel like in the VR space, they're going to have to figure that out too. But I do think that at least I think VR, there's a lot of like video game applications and honestly like porn and stuff like that. But I think one of the top applications is actually remote work. I think if they can figure out a way that you can have goggles on that don't make you look like a psychopath, and you actually, and honestly, like little things like, do they make your face hot? Like things like that. I don't want to wear something that makes my face hot all day. But if you could interact anywhere in the globe with your coworkers, like in a conference room, and really collaborate, that actually might be the answer to the whole work from home collaboration issue. I just think that they probably need to work on the technology a little bit more because they're not quite there yet.
Yeah, the timing is interesting to me too because of the collapse in commercial real estate recently. I know some executives are trying to hold on to their offices, but I think I've heard some say that, work from home would prevent that from happening, where you can just stay at home all the time and maybe in the future use those goggles for that sort of thing. I will say this, I got a statistic here from Forbes. In terms of work from home, 93% of employers plan to continue conducting job interviews remotely. Do you think that's the right move?
There's a lot wrong with job interviews. I don't think that remotely doing them is one of the things that's wrong with it. I actually think that remote interviews may be able to help in some ways in terms of like, overtly people being biased against and that kind of thing. But doing an effective, like structured job interview is difficult, and most people don't know how to do it. And as some of the recent research has come out, has shown that a structured job interview is the number one best predictive technique for selecting someone that's going to do well on the job. I'm I think that if we were going to invest more time, my investment wouldn't be on the debate whether you should do it in person or remotely. It would be on how to do structured interviews more effectively.
Yeah, I would agree with that. What are your thoughts then on multiple rounds of interviews? I've seen some tech jobs list that they have 5 or 6 rounds of interviews. What is your appropriate number for your take on a candidate?
I mean, there's lots of companies that have done research on this, and I've seen people put out like the optimum number where you plateau after that, and there's a point of diminishing returns is like 4 interviews. I know Google put out their famous research on that, and I know a few other companies have replicated that. I think 1 is too few, just logically, because obviously one person only can see one person's perspective on another person's potential performance. Whereas, like, do you need 12? 12 is obviously too many. I think when you get between like 3 and 6, that's where there's room for debate, right? Is 5 too many? Maybe. Is 3 too few? Maybe. But I think 1 is obviously too few, and 10 is obviously too many.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I also wanted to touch on workforce planning. I listened to an episode of your podcast where you were talking about it during COVID, and I thought this was a really interesting topic. Did tech companies purposely overhire, or was it a massive oversight?
You actually wrote an article on this. I don't know if you saw it, but it was called, I think it was something like workforce planning and tech layoffs or something like that. And I put the layoffs at least squarely at the feet of tech executives, because I did just some very crude analysis to show that the companies that didn't overhire, lo and behold, didn't do layoffs. And the companies that did overhire, lo and behold, did a bunch of layoffs. And those outcomes were completely foreseeable. Now, to be charitable to them at the same time, this was very much of the notion of the things that were happening over the last 20 years of what's been called the war for talent. But it ratcheted up so much more during COVID because of all the money that got stimulated into the economy. And so salaries were going up. People were being poached left and right. The war for talent was probably at its apex. And a lot of people called it the Great Resignation. I don't know if you remember that phrase, but really what the Great Resignation was the great influx of money into the economy and salaries being inflated. And therefore, there was blood in the water in terms of companies competing with each other. However, how they reacted to that is what I think is blamable, which they said, you know what we'll do? We're flush with all this money, and we have a competitive advantage over most firms for hiring people because we can pay more, generally speaking, and we have higher margins, and therefore we can take more bloat. Let's just hoover up all the talent we possibly can and see what happens. Which I know there was more method to the madness than how I just described it. But for all intents and purposes, that was the outcome. That was a consequence of their decisions. And obviously it was foreseeable that if you hire more than your demand dictates, investors are actually going to pressure you to increase your margins and to lower your OpEx and and those things are going to push you to lay off those people that you brought on at one point in time when things calm down and maybe, the world is not so flush with stimulus. And so I just saw it as completely foreseeable outcome, and lo and behold, that's what happened.
Do you think it was a greater benefit for some companies to hire that many people and then lay them off versus the companies who decided not to?
I mean, I feel like this is like the whole, is it better to have loved than lost than never loved in the first place kind of thing. It's like, I don't know, if you had a great job, but then you got laid off and now, you have no job, is that better? Or would it have been better if you just never left your old crappy job? I don't know. Like, I feel like that these are a personal question that most people can answer with their own set of values.
Yeah. I actually gave a presentation on Elon Musk when I was still in school last year, around the time when the Twitter layoffs were happening, because I talked about, the influx of employees. If you just showed a chart of Twitter headcount and compared it to to COVID and when everything spiked, it almost lined up exactly with where you would think it would at the influx.
Yeah.
So do you think that Elon Musk then handled that situation appropriately when he came onto Twitter?
So I don't honestly, I didn't follow it closely enough to be like, oh, he should have done this and not that. But I mean, I want to frame this appropriately. Twitter was not the only company that laid off tens of thousands of people, right? It was a lot of companies that were like Twitter and not like Twitter that did it. And so I don't know if it's his management style or it was just a greater trend in that industry at the time, but there was a lot of bloat that was going on and a lot of different leaders made those decisions.
Yeah, that's something that I noted in that paper as well. And the layoffs would continue happening, or in that presentation, they would continue happening months after I gave that presentation. I think he laid off about 80% of the company, about 6,500 employees.
I mean, like realistically, Twitter is what, it's like a news feed or like a, you type in 280 characters or whatever it was. It's not that complicated of an application, right? Do you need 10,000 people to run that company when I'm pretty sure you could? And the reason why I say this is I want to say I heard that Facebook created threads with like 50 people. So if Facebook can create threads with 50 people and Twitter has 10,000 employees, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
I'm not sure if it's true. I saw a rumor somewhere that said that they made threads after Musk released the source code to the Twitter algorithm.
Maybe, but it's not like there wasn't, source code for creating websites already out there.
Yeah,
right.
With efficient algorithms. I mean, it is.
Yeah,
it is Facebook as well. It does have its own algorithm already. So
exactly. It's not like they've never built an algorithm.
Yeah. So with all the layoffs that have been happening in analytics and tech and in HR, even, what do you see coming in the future? Do you think this is going to end anytime soon? Do you think the economy is going to worsen?
I mean, I'm not an economist, and I'm not even sure most economists know what's going to happen. But it does seem like a weird time. It's hard to make sense of. I made a post not that long ago about how weird the market is for people analytics jobs because there's so much conflicting information. I just put a bunch of charts out there that are like, you can kind of make sense of them, but like, here's something I don't know how to wrap my mind around, right? The unemployment rate is at, historic lows still. And, consumer spending is still at highs, but everybody I know says their companies are cutting people and their budgets are being cut and everything is difficult. And I don't know how to make sense of all of this because clearly the information is conflicting in ways I don't understand. Like if unemployment rates are at like 3%, you should be able to get a job in like an hour. And then I know people and I see people who say, I've been on the job market for 7 months and I can't find a job. Right. I don't know how to reconcile those things. So it seems very weird. And in a weird situation with a lot of uncertainty, it's difficult to model out what the future will hold.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they're coming up with the unemployment statistics. I know every month for at least the last 5 months, they come out with the report and it's always revised down from where it was. So there's more unemployment than they initially had stated. The jobs report, that is.
Yeah.
I've been following that closely.
Well, I will say this. Here's one thing, and I talked to, because I've had some guests on my podcast that were economists, and they sort of disagree with me about this, but I think the general theme is correct, which is a lot of the layoffs happen in high-paying white-collar jobs, and a lot of the jobs that are being created right now are lower-paying blue-collar type or service-type jobs. And therefore, when you're laid off in a white-collar job, you don't necessarily want to go get a blue-collar or service job. Right. And maybe you don't have the skills to do it. And so there's like a imbalance in the economy between folks who are actually being displaced and the jobs that are being created. And so everybody's saying, look how many jobs are out there and how quickly you can find a job. But it's, if you were making, I don't know, $150,000 a year and all the jobs that you can find are $25,000 a year, is that really a strong economy? I would beg to differ.
Yeah, I also saw some people stating that a good portion of the jobs that have been created are actually government jobs.
Yeah.
And so that could be, direct manipulation from the federal government and or White House, however you want to look at it.
I mean, I don't know about that. What I will say is that there's specific requirements that it takes to get a lot of federal jobs, right? And so there are barriers to entry there. So it's not like something you can just wake up one morning and go get a federal job. There are jobs like that, but a lot of them have clearances and certifications and prior prerequisites that you have to have that are just closed off to a lot of people, or at least it takes a lot of time to get them.
Yeah, they're a lot about the hours spent in those previous jobs at the GS levels for
Yeah,
you to be able
exactly.
to move up that hierarchy.
Yep.
Yeah, overall, I'm not really certain where it's going to go either. I don't see anybody being very optimistic about the state of things right now. So I like to ask everybody that question. I think everyone has a unique perspective. But from what I've seen, I see a lot of people also saying, it's that people have multiple jobs. So the number of jobs per person has actually gone up, which is artificially inflating that number.
I got a podcast. I do a bunch of advisory work. I have a day job, and I got like a bunch of mentoring and stuff. Like I have like uncompensated work too. So yeah, I feel you on like there's this push to everybody's kind of got to be like their own corporation almost. It's like you have to be able to do a little bit of everything.
They call it personal branding. That's what they're calling it nowadays. I saw on your LinkedIn profile, I was like, wow, you're in like 5 different organizations right now. That must be a lot of work.
It is. I'm very, very busy.
So I also watched one of your episodes where you talked about whether or not someone should pursue a PhD. What are your thoughts on that? I'd like to talk about that. I know it's specific on the industry, but just as a general rule of thumb.
To be fair, I think I was talking about like getting like an IO psychology PhD, which is what I have my PhD in.
That's relevant to me. So
yeah. But I guess PhD more generally, I think some of the general calculus that should go into it is the time value of how long it's going to take going to be worth the return that it makes after you have done it, right? And so realistically, I think there's really 3 scenarios about getting a PhD, and one of which I would say you should definitely go get a PhD, and 2 of which I would say it's much more arguable that maybe you shouldn't, right? The one scenario is you really, really, really want to become world-class at learning and doing research and studying, and you're really willing to dedicate almost monk-like discipline to pursuing that for multiple years. And I would say in that scenario, you absolutely should go get a PhD because you are prepared and that is what you will want to do. All right. The second scenario is the person who thinks that another credential behind their name is going to make them more employable. Generally speaking, that's not actually true. You know what trumps that every time is experience. Getting real experience will overcome a credential almost every time. All right. And then the last one, and this is kind of where it is debatable, is there are certain types of knowledge that you gain in a PhD that will help you in certain scenarios in the working world. In those scenarios, the trade-off is the time it takes to gain that skill worth what it would take to get like the small number of jobs that require those things. And the reason why I say that is because we've talked a lot about AI on this podcast, but even without AI, there's a lot of information that you can go learn that doesn't require going into a PhD program, but would give you PhD level talent, right? If you're just willing to push yourself, dedicate yourself, really be thorough. And I think AI is only going to exacerbate the democratization of that type of knowledge. And therefore, at this point in time, I think it's much more debatable because you're not just making the decision today, I'm going to enter a PhD program. It's also a decision of 4, 5, 6 years from now, when you're exiting the PhD program, what is the world you're going to be exiting into? And that's going to be a very, very different world. And so I think if you were making this decision 15 years ago, because there was less democratized information, the AI was still 15 years away, absolutely, go get the PhD. But right now, I think it's much more debatable that what the future is going to look like 6 years from now is still your PhD is even going to be relevant.
Yeah, I've been saying for a while, ever since AI popped off, that we're finally beginning that transition from a knowledge-based economy to a skills-based economy. Whereas it used to be the other way around, where you would get those positions because you were so highly credentialed. There were less ways in which you could measure those sorts of skills. Think about consulting gigs. Now, lots of times they are just looking for that experience over the knowledge that you could say, just go online and read a few articles or a book about and make those decisions on your own.
I mean, I feel like, just to build on your analogy of like a knowledge based to a skills based, my tact on it would be is like the U.S. economy used to be like nepotism based, and then it moved to like credential based, and then it was, I guess you could say, quasi knowledge and skill based. But I actually see where it's going is going to be more like, what do I call it, like execution based, where it's like people who act and act quickly will benefit versus people who don't act quickly.
So performance based almost.
Well, I mean, you can perform slowly, right? Right. I think I really mean it's like, or maybe like urgency based or something like that. Again, I don't know if I have the right words for it.
Yeah, I hear that reference by some social media influencers right now. I think it was Elon Musk had that quote about a sense of urgency that he has in everything that defines all of his companies. So now I see that everywhere with urgency. I could totally understand that, though. Do you think that would impact the amount of hours that people are going to be required to work in the future? I know, I think it was a paper somewhere that, or maybe it was a news article that mentioned that people in India are starting to shift to 70-hour work weeks to be able to compete on a global scale with larger economies. Do you think we're going to see that same sort of thing on our end?
I think we're in a high variance world. Like some people are pushing for like 4-day work weeks and, working less, and, AI is going to automate everything. And we should just take all that extra productivity and put it in the bank, and we could all like eat grapes all day. And then other folks are like, well, not only do I have to outperform, everyone else in the world, I have to outperform AI. So I got to work 70 or 80 hours a week because, I'm in this precarious position. And I think we're just in a high variance world. I think that you're going to see a variety of outcomes. I don't think there's going to be one singular way that this happens. I think one of the interesting things, though, about you mentioned the example from India, and I think China has gone through their own similar struggles where they had like I can't remember the exact number, but it's like 8 hours a day, 6 days a week or something like that. And they've had like a lot of political and internal strife about that. There were lower cost to operate countries in the world and higher cost to operate countries. And one of the ways that lower cost to operate countries were able to get ahead is they would say, we'll work undesirable hours and we'll do jobs that you don't want to do at a lower cost structure. And that was kind of like the first wave of outsourcing that happened, right? But now a lot of those lower cost to operate countries are actually getting much more expensive to operate in. So they're not so much lower cost. And so the only way that equation continues to work is if their productivity goes up or their quality goes up or both, right? And so that means that they have to increase their own knowledge and skills, to your point from earlier, or they just have to work longer hours, right? And so I think that is where you kind of see these type of pressure and demands is like we had an outsourcing culture. The outsourcing model is being broken in some ways. How do we keep the model running? And this is one of those ways to keep the model running.
Yeah, that's a great answer. We talked before also about PhDs, but in terms of general college degrees, with that sort of transition to a skills economy from knowledge work, how do you think AI will impact the usefulness of college degrees? Do you see it kind of trending down? Because I see a lot of people, more than ever, I've seen people online mentioning that they're not using anything that they got out of their degree, especially in undergraduate programs.
I don't know. I really struggle with this one. And the reason why it's different than the PhD is a lot of times PhD programs are paid for and you receive some kind of like assistantship or stipend or research, graduate assistantship or whatever it may be. And so it's more like a job, right? Whereas undergrad is not like a job. I just don't see how you can justify some of these schools where you're racking up $200,000 or $300,000 of non-dischargeable debt. Like I don't see how that can be worth it. I mean, even if you learned how to like mine gold completely reliably out of the ground, like it would still take an immense amount of gold that you would have to mine for it to be worth it. And I don't know. Like, I mean, there obviously are lower cost options out there, and like not every school is going to cost you $200,000 or $300,000, and scholarships still exist, so you can still get full rides to, even prestigious universities, and there's still grants, especially for folks with lower socioeconomic status and that type of thing. But generally, like if you're going to assume hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, I just think that's a bad decision. Like I don't know how you get around it. And if you can find a workaround where you don't have to do that, then absolutely go after it. But I just think it just creates a more unequal world. If we want to live in a more egalitarian world, strapping some people with $300,000 worth of debt and not giving them a house or something to show for it, or like 7 cars as like collateral, I just don't think that that's a fair world that I want to live in.
I agree. I think a lot of the loans are a bit predatory, especially on the personal end, for personal loans. I do see a lot of clips around right now of Dave Ramsey. He'll be taking calls, and he'll get a call in from people who racked up that debt in college. I think there was one where this couple, the man had been working, got his bachelor's in like engineering or something along those lines, while his wife went to school for dentistry, and she racked up $250,000 a year in debt. So they were over $1 million in debt. And despite how much you make as a dentist, I don't know how you can come back from that when you think about interest.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't use this term lightly, but that seems unjust. And it does seem somewhat like indentured servitude, right? If you said you graduate now and you owe $1 million and there's no way you can get rid of it, and you might have to work your whole life and never pay it back, how is that different than indentured servitude? I don't see it.
Yeah, I think history is not going to treat that situation too kindly. When my dad went to school, he went to a top-notch engineering school. So he was born in the 60s, so it would have been in the 80s. I think he paid $5,000 a year, and now it's up to $50,000 at that same school.
Yeah. It's unconscionable.
It's not realistic for anybody anymore, especially as socioeconomic status keeps getting downgraded among most people in the US.
And I think this is where your original question you were kind of getting at. It's the collision of two trends, which is the cost of college is exceeding inflation, and inflation's already high, but it is exceeding inflation. And it has been for a long time. So it's going up. The quality of college correspondingly of like the things that you learn is going down. And at some point, those two trends intersect. I don't know exactly when they intersected, but I think it was in our past. I don't think it was in our future, right? And so at every moment past that intersection, the value proposition goes worse and worse and worse. And so if we are saying that to achieve the American dream or something like that, you must have a college degree, I think that's a fundamentally unfair proposition. And I think that we have to find alternative pathways. Maybe AI is one of them, to reignite to make a more, a society of equal opportunity.
Yeah, I don't know how it will all, end up at the very end of things, let's say in 50 years time, but I do foresee, and this is my prediction, I guess you can write this down for, 20 years from now. I think we're going to see a collapse of a lot of those more expensive institutions that.
Well, that's already coming anyway, right? And it has nothing to do with the cost. What people don't realize is that and this is actually related to workforce planning and demography. I talked about this in an article I wrote about demographics, that in the year 2008, when the Great Recession occurred, a lot less kids were born. And so the millennial generation, which was before that, was the biggest generation in history. And colleges all grew as a consequence of just there were just way more millennials. Then in 2008 happened, and the millennial generation was ending, first of all, but second of all, a lot less people were just born, more generally speaking, and those kids are turning 18 in the next few years, right? All the kids in 2026 that would have been born in 2008 were turning 18, and they're going to be slated to go to college. And there's just going to be millions and millions less of them than there were in prior generations. And as a consequence, college enrollments are going to go down just because of demographic factors. And so college administrators know this, and there will be consolidation. There will be closing down because the model of this like forever growth of students going into college will go away.
Yeah, I've looked at that stuff before. I don't think put the pieces together in terms of what that would do for colleges, because I didn't think the U.S. is really at that point yet. But I guess if you're right about 2008, I mean that the time frame works out great. When do you see that then, I guess, starting to impact it?
It's already actually kind of starting now, but the real demographic shift is going to happen 2025, 2026, which is not that far off.
The timing there is also lines up with everything else, it seems. So
yep,
that will be interesting to see which schools survive. Good thing the bigger ones have been collecting money for a while. So
yeah, if you have a multi-billion-dollar endowment, I'm sure you're going to be fine.
So I imagine you're familiar with the replication crisis in psychology.
Yeah, we talked about it a lot on the podcast.
Yeah. So what's causing that? Why is it such a problem nowadays? I see reference more generally throughout science, but most specifically in the social sciences.
I mean, like any complex phenomena is multivariate, right? I think the most simple explanation is there is a system of incentives that is misaligned for good science to happen. One of those incentives is it is very, very hard to get an academic job because there are less of them. It's very, very hard to get tenure once you do get one of those academic jobs, and therefore it creates an environment of publish or perish. However, because of those tenure requirements, they only accept journal publications in certain top journals. Therefore, there's immense pressure, like an untalked about crushing pressure to get multiple publications into top journals when you're at your least prestigious part of your career, right? And so the most pressure is when you're least prepared to deal with it. Well, guess what? Pressure leads to a lot of different unsavory outcomes at times, some of which is things like faking data, making up false responses. And we had a guy named Marcus Crede, who's a pretty prominent researcher on our podcast, and he says in the social sciences, he suspects somewhere around a third, if not more, of published science in top journals is completely, I think he said fabricated, but I'll just say junk science, right? A third, which that's insane. That is just way too high. And so the replication crisis is a function of, if and then there's a whole series of research practices that are called like p-hacking and harking and all of these type of things that have been identified as like causes of this. But actually, I would just say they are symptoms. The disease is the pressured environment and the system of incentives that leads to this. And so there's a movement called the open science movement that is pushing for practices that will mitigate a lot of the quote unquote, like what I called symptoms of the disease, but they aren't going to fix people's hearts. Like if you knew that you could change a few data points and that would get you published in a top journal, and that would mean the difference between your getting tenure and not getting tenure at a most prestigious university or getting a job in the first place at that university, and no one would be able to detect that if you change that data, that would happen. I don't think you're ever going to be able to fix that unless you change the system of incentives. AI is actually going to contribute to this also in a very negative way, because I've seen multiple graphs of there's just so much more junk research being created and submitted to top journals since AI has come into effect. And so it's going to get more difficult to sort the wheat from the chaff as time goes along. And therefore, when you try to replicate the finding of the junk science, it doesn't replicate. And then that decreases trust in science overall. So it's a very, very bad situation.
Yeah, I think it doesn't help that, American culture has become secularized over the years and almost embraced this sort of scientism.
Yeah, I don't think I'm looking at it from that perspective, though. The thing that I noticed, and I feel like I can speak differently about this than a lot of academics, is academics have to act like everything's fine, right? If you act like things aren't fine, people are like, oh, that's the person who's faking it, right? Oh, they're feeling the pressure. I'm actually the good scientist. They're the bad scientist because they're feeling the pressure. I'm like, no, this is not a good or bad scientist phenomena. This is a system of incentives. If you're creating the wrong incentives, you like it's like what's the favorite Charlie Munger quote? It's like, if you show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcome. This is absolutely one of those situations where we as a collective have to change the system of incentives, or we will continue to get this outcome.
What should those incentives look like?
I think the incentive should be, if you have a really good, I mean, this is going to sound really idealistic and I don't have a fix to this problem, but let's do some pie in the sky talking for a second. If you have a really, really stellar idea that hasn't been tried out before, go collect some data, figure out if your idea is worthy or not based on the data and the results that you find, and publish what you find, regardless of whether it's a rock star finding or a null finding. That's the only solution. That's it.
So I would almost say it seems like most universities, they're trying to get that grant money. And so you are incentivized in that way to make those big findings and make these gigantic claims.
Yeah.
Would you say maybe try paying the teachers or professors more for the teaching rather than the grant writing and research? Or do you think that's sustainable?
You're like I just don't feel qualified to talk about like the inner workings of a university because I just don't know. Right. Like I've never applied for a grant. I've never gone up for tenure. I've never been a dean or something like that. I don't know. And so I assume that it's very complicated and that good people are trying to do the right things. But again, there's probably a lot of pressure on them and it's making it more difficult than it should be.
Yeah. I actually had a quote here about the replication crisis, kind of gave some statistics. So it says that in economics, 61% of the 18 studies replicated, as did 62% of the 21 studies published in Nature and Science, but only 39% of the 100 experiments successfully replicated in psychology, and that on average, papers that failed to replicate are cited 16 times more per year. That's from UC San Diego Today.
Yeah, that's pretty bad, right? What that's saying is like, that even creates even more incentive, right? Because it's like, hey, you want to get famous? Yeah. Create something that doesn't replicate, right?
Yeah, I mean, make those bogus claims, then, if people fail to replicate it, you say, well, you just didn't do it right. I'm the genius. It seems like it's a never-ending
but that's been settled.
paradox.
There have been whole debates that have been going on for years now and multiple replications that have failed. And again, I don't think it's just a situation of a few bad apples like here and there. It is a fundamental, like, we have an issue. We need to address this issue.
What do you think the long-term outcomes are of this sort of thing?
I mean, the thing I said on the podcast the other day is if some of these findings are as true as they say they are, which they may not be, I don't know. But if they are, you almost have to start over. I said, make a list of like the top 50 findings in IO psychology. And now we got to go redo all of them to see if they're still true, right? Go find the top 50 things that are feel like, goal setting theory and, Schmidt and Hunter was just overturned, whatever, not that long ago. Like what are the things that are the most important? And we've got to go redo all of the science on all of them and work our way down the list until we get to ground truth, because that's what science about. Is it not? We never get to ground truth, but we pursue getting to ground truth.
100%. Well, I do have one last question here. What do you think the most employable skills will be in the future then? Let's assume that you don't need college anymore and everything went bad in terms of research and your degrees. Now everyone's just working on their own to become the most employable with skills and experience. How should they do that?
They should all become plumbers. I find that everything I've ever seen about plumbers and electricians and carpenters, all those type of people, I've never seen anyone that says, yeah, that job's going to be automated pretty soon. So go become a plumber. I know that that was supposed to be, that was sort of tongue in cheek, but if you mean like, white collar skills, my rule has always been critical thinking, right? Critical thinking is upstream of almost every positive consequence of skills and knowledge and abilities downstream. If you can cultivate the ability to critically think, that will be a highly transferable thing into an uncertain future.
How would you demonstrate that to a potential employer?
I would actually, I don't think a lot of employers are actually assessing for this, which is a big problem that I have. So I would say you actually probably don't even have to demonstrate it because they're not selecting for it in the first place. They're selecting for all the wrong things. But I would say if you actually did have to demonstrate it to an employer, is the easiest way is to be able to put a counter argument behind anything you say. Right. So if you make an assertion why X should happen, you should also be able to make the assertion why X should not happen. And if you can do that effectively, you have the ability to critically think. If you cannot do that effectively, you're essentially just a rote, repetitive person who can memorize something and repeat it back to you, which guess what? Computers are already way better at than humans before AI even existed. And AI is even better than the computers were at doing it. So if all you have is rote, that's not going to be good.
That's a great answer.
Thank you.
So where can people find you if they'd like to hear more?
Yeah. I mean, add me on LinkedIn, Cole Napper, or listening to Directionally Correct. And I have a newsletter as well on Substack under the same name, Directionally Correct. So check it out.
Awesome. You got anything else in the pipeline?
In terms of what?
Working on any future articles or any episodes with specific guests coming on?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we have, I think we're booked out for like 7 months. And I think I have like 5 articles in the pipeline. I'm kind of, when it comes to writing, I'm sort of manic. And so some things I'll be writing over like 6 months and another article I'll write in like 6 hours and just publish it. And so I all that to say, I guess I don't have a stable pipeline of what I put out there.
Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Johnny. And I'll try to do my best to promote what you're doing because it seems fun and interesting.
Yeah, enjoyed talking to you. I hope we can do it again.
Thanks, man.